This is episode 30 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I am Emily Ison, Townhouse Steward at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
From that, you get a picture of a Magus, a very bookish, learned person, studies Plato, knows lots of languages, interested in really all the sciences, and is searching for some kind of deeper understanding.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
The character of Prospero in The Tempest is full of magic, superstition, and the question for the audience about whether Prospero is a good man or a selfish and greedy villain. Then, of course, we have to ask, was he even a real man at all? Or is Prospero something supernatural? When The Tempest was first staged, it was done so before King James I at a celebration for All Hallows Day in 1611. As King James himself was highly suspicious of all things magic and supernatural, it's impressive that Shakespeare managed to get away with portraying such a highly complicated wizard of magic like Prospero, particularly when you consider that King James had, only 2 years before The Tempest, put Elizabeth I's popular Magus and one potential source for Shakespeare, John Dee, on trial for suspicion of witchcraft. In this week's episode, Malcolm Hebron is our guest today to help us unravel the strands of history from fiction as we explore the real-life Renaissance figure, often seen at English royal courts, of the Magus, and how this contemporary wizard-like figure from the real life of William Shakespeare may have influenced the fictional character of Prospero, as well as that character's reception on stage when Shakespeare was writing and performing his play, The Tempest. Malcolm Hebron is head of drama at Winchester College, where he also teaches English literature and art history. His publications include Mastering the Language of Literature and Key Concepts in Renaissance Literature, and he is currently working on Renaissance philosophy for an online resource. He joins us in today's episode to discuss the subject of his recent article for the British Library titled Prospero, a Renaissance Magus. Malcolm, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
For the culture of Shakespeare's audience in the 16th to 17th century in England, what was the Magus, and why would a portrayal of it on stage have been instantly recognizable for Shakespeare's audience?
Okay, well, maybe let's think of one particular Magus, maybe the start of the bunch, Marsilio Ficino, and one of Cosimo's scouts, a monk called Leonardo. He's just been through Macedonia, and he comes in with this book, the Corpus Hermeticum, the texts of Hermes Trismegistus, who they thought some ancient sage. And Cosimo says, put Plato on hold. Hermes is much more important. And from that, you get a picture of a Magus, a very bookish, learned person, studies Plato, knows lots of languages, interested in really all the sciences, and is searching for some kind of deeper understanding of the way the earth and the heavens work together, the operation of the cosmos, a combination of what we would think of as scientists. So we imagine a Magus to someone in Shakespeare's time, a guy with a beard, very, very deeply learned, maybe traveling around, living off the patronage of princes. Some were practicing doctors. So, and perhaps slightly frightening people, as they had all this secret knowledge, this esoteric, occult wisdom, which sometimes they could claim to actually use to make things happen in the world, which made them suspicious to the church as well.
Are these the characteristics that made Prospero in The Tempest? Is that why we think of him as a type of Magus?
Remember, people who plotted against him, Caliban says, get his books. That's a key to his power. That's a very Magus-like quality. Spells and commands he seems to be able to do over nature. They're quite Magus-like as well. Other aspects of Prospero, maybe less so. When he's putting on the mask, he's much more like a kind of stage illusionist, a technician, if you will. So there are aspects of the Magus to Prospero, but he's been compared to lots of other types as well.
Now, in his article for the British Library, Malcolm suggests that Prospero from the Tempest was a kind of, quote, wizard from Hogwarts. Now, Malcolm, if Prospero was a reflection of an actual human figure existing in Shakespeare's lifetime, is the magic that Prospero performs in the play something that would have been happening in real-life London in the 16th century?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I'm interested that I said he was a wizard, because in some ways, an old wizard, someone like Merlin from the Arthur stories, is a wizard, maybe of diabolical parentage. He can tell the future, interpret portents. Prospero is rather different from that. He's much more bookish. Like we said, the Magus is a bookish, learned person. Some of his tricks, filling a table with food and then making it disappear. Apparently there is a book from the period somewhere which actually tells you how to do that. The great scholar of magic in the period, the American scholar Barbara Mowat, which he says in some ways he does some of the things a kind of street conjurer would have done. And these street conjurers had boy assistants. And Ariel is something like that. So some of his tricks would have been recognizable, I think, to people of the period. And they would certainly have believed in the presence of spirits and invisible hierarchies and so on.
Well, John Dee is perhaps the most well-known Magus of Shakespeare's lifetime, and he was even considered one possible source Shakespeare might have used to develop the character of Prospero. And I wondered, what are some of the things about John Dee's life as a Magus that make him a potential source for William Shakespeare?
Yeah, well, he's a fascinating figure, John Dee of Mortlake. This association, as far as I know, was made first, I think, by the scholar Francis Yates in the 1960s. Of course, for a long time, the fashion was to see Prospero as being based on Shakespeare himself. He's an illusionist, and the play is something to do with Shakespeare's farewell to the theatre, abjuring his own magic. Francis Yates felt that Prospero was based on John Dee, and John Dee is a figure of a white magician, a theurgist. What were the parallels? Well, John Dee was certainly a very, very bookish person. When he went to university in Cambridge, he worked out a way of studying for 18 hours a day, only sleeping for 4, so he could be wrapped in his studies all the time. When he was at Cambridge, John Dee made this extraordinary mechanical flying beetle for a production of an Aristophanes play. And he himself said all the accusations later of him being some kind of wizard, performing conjurations, came back to that spectacular trick. John Dee was a brilliant mathematician, lectured on maths at Louvain at Paris. He was deeply interested in navigation. Maybe there's parallel with Prospero here and the Tempest. John Dee was a huge proponent of Queen Elizabeth building her empire. He'd worked out a scheme for her to rule Canada and Greenland and challenge the Pope's division of the Americas. And Prospero as a kind of colonial ruler, he fits in some of that too. But there are other bits that clearly don't fit. John Dee was mainly suspicious to the authorities that he spent years trying to conjure up these angels to tell him about the language in which God spoke to Adam, the Edenic language. Well, Prospero doesn't do that. He has Ariel easily at his command. John Dee didn't have anything like Caliban in his life. Prospero clearly has this slave.
John Dee does have that dynamic that Prospero has of history not really being sure whether he was a good guy or a bad guy, because as Malcolm points out in his article, the Tempest came out just 2 years after John Dee was forced to defend himself in the court of King James I and prove, quote, that his practices were in harmony with the divine. And though he succeeded, John Dee died poor and disgraced in 1608. And I wanted to ask you, Malcolm, if John Dee is the inspiration behind Prospero, and for the sake of this question, we'll assume he is in some way, then when we look at the play, what are we supposed to see Prospero as? Is he a good guy or a bad guy?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Both you talked about John Dee as a charismatic and very ambiguous figure. What's he up to? Well, let's look at for and against. So for Francis Yates, or the great Shakespeare critic Frank Kermode, Prospero is a good magus, a good wizard. He's a theurgist. He's a white magician. He's a kind of holy man, using his powers for the purposes of redemption, healing. He's bringing his enemies to repentance. He doesn't harm hair on their head. He's trying to make the world a better place. He's creating a noble line for his family, and he's making sure that the marriage of Ferdinand and Miranda is solid, is based on chastity and loyalty. And he's on some kind of Neoplatonic ascent to higher and higher nobility. And he'll go back and resume order. So that's Prospero as a good person, perhaps drawing on some of the positive qualities of Dee. He's a kind of alchemist, maybe trying to distill and purify human nature. But it doesn't work. People don't come to repentance. They don't reform themselves in the way maybe he hopes they would. His brother says absolutely nothing when he's forgiven.
As you mentioned, in Act 5 of The Tempest, Prospero gives this declaration. He says, quote, "Graves at my command have waked their sleepers." And you mentioned that he's playing God, and I found that in context, this is being performed for the first time before King James's court. Was it not considered blasphemous for Prospero to make a statement like that? Can you portray blasphemous material on stage before King James?
There are two things to say about that one, at least two. One, that it's a quotation from an English translation, Arthur Golding's translation of Ovid, where pretty much the same thing is spoken by the sorceress Medea. And some scholars, Jonathan Bate, for example, have said that a learned audience able to pick that up, that would immediately be sending alarm bells. This is bad stuff. This is playing God. This is Prospero as a sorcerer. These lines are leading up to him abjuring his rough magic. So maybe the justification for this extraordinary speech, which kind of comes out of nowhere, whose graves has he been opening on this island in the last 12 years, is justified because it is Prospero's renunciation of his magic. He's actually reforming himself in these lines.
Well, in his article, one of the things that I really liked about Malcolm's article was he talks about the Magus and therefore Prospero would have been very well read. Now, one of the texts Malcolm suggests Prospero may have been familiar with is the Kabbalah, the secret Hebrew law given to Moses. And I wanted to ask about this because this text was unique in that it had, quote, deeper meanings encrypted within the letters of the text. And Malcolm, for someone like William Shakespeare, who was already masterful at double meanings with words anyway, I have to think he would have latched onto this and been fascinated with that idea. So I want to ask you, is there any evidence to suggest that there are similar coded messages hidden inside the Tempest where the letters of the words contain a message?
Wow, that's quite a question. And I have to say, I'm absolutely not a scholar of the Kabbalah at all, but these Magi were. Now, people have pointed out, for example, alchemical references in the Tempest. The Tempest itself apparently is a term in alchemy for boiling an alembic. And there are some writers on Shakespeare who feel these wisdom traditions, including the Kabbalah, alchemy, Neoplatonism, that they are there in the language of the play. They point out quite rightly that Shakespeare's age, if you look across the arts, these people, they loved riddles, they loved puzzles, emblems, a picture that seems simple but has a meaning underneath. They wrote allegories. Of course, a great Elizabethan poet, Edmund Spenser, wrote this vast poem, The Fairy Queen, where everything has at least a double meaning. They were into heraldry, they were into symbols. And of course, Shakespeare loved puns, a kind of high-velocity metaphor. Philip Sidney, in his book on Apology for Poetry, talks about poems, a dark conceit, concealing further meanings within themselves. So coming from that, people have said, well, there are these secret references going on. We have to be a little bit careful in that it's a kind of different thing from a public poem. We don't know if the text we have is how close it is to what Shakespeare's characters actually spoke on stage.
Since it wasn't designed to be written down, it's a shaky theory. Yeah.
It may maybe something like the sonnets, where care clearly was taken over the printing and publication, whereas, of course, the editions we have of Shakespeare come from some time after the play, although seem to be quite hurried Corso editions. But there are books out there by people very learned in these traditions who say there are things going on, as it were, beneath the text.
Well, I wanted to ask about the average playgoer receiving what's going on stage. To understand Prospero fully, just in our conversation, we've already mentioned very complicated ideas like alchemy, Neoplatonism, and other avenues of classical learning where were these references that are included in Shakespeare's plays. Does that go over the heads of the people sitting in the groundlings area of the theater, or are they typically well read enough to recognize the depth of Prospero's character on stage?
Again, it's just so fascinating, isn't it, to speculate how much these audiences picked up. And I'm sure we know from our personal experience, a Shakespeare play can have an enormous impact, even if we're only picking up 20-30% of what's going on, of the language. And it's very interesting after that. I suppose the question is, how necessary is it to recognize all of these things in order to let the play to do its work on us? We can feel very pleased with ourselves when we learn this stuff later. But it's not necessary in the theatrical moment. The average playgoer's knowledge of the question has been asked about his language too. All these new words in a late play like Tempest, he's writing these strange verse lines and sentences. And some have thought that, yes, an audience even of the time would have struggled to keep up with that. Others have felt they lived in a very verbally vibrant culture and would have been better placed than us to pick these things up.
So Shakespeare staged The Tempest right after Ben Jonson staged The Alchemist. I think The Alchemist came out a year before, and that's assuming the 1610 to 1611 is the right date for The Tempest, obviously. But is there a relationship between these two plays? I know Shakespeare and Jonson were very close, and it seems ironic, to say the least, that Jonson would stage a play so similar to The Tempest in subject matter just 1 year apart.
In fact, the relationship was even closer than that because both plays were performed by Shakespeare's company, the King's Men. And it's thought, we don't know for sure, but the likelihood is that the two main parts, Subtle in The Alchemist and Prospero in The Tempest, were both played by the same actor, Shakespeare's star performer, Richard Burbage. So a kind of meta-theatrical possibility. I wonder if some of the audience watching The Tempest would have then had a memory of Burbage being this trickster and the alchemist.
Well, we've covered an immense swath of territory today in terms of the Magus and Prospero and even just the Tempest, but there's so much more to explore that I want to ask you about your recommended resources. What do you recommend we read or look at online to learn more about this topic?
Well, you mentioned John Dee earlier, and just to read a biography of John Dee is a very good way of spending a few hours. There are two recent ones by Glyn Parry, who I believe you've interviewed, a great scholar, and Benjamin Bully.
Yes, excellent resources. Thank you for those. Now, this next question, we ask everyone this here at That Shakespeare Life, and that is the one book you would take with you on a deserted island if you can only take one. And my friends in England tell me I have to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible.
Oh, yes, because of our noble program, Desert Island Discs. Well, what book would I... This is probably the worst choice ever for a Desert Island book when you want to sort of keep your spirits up. But the huge Renaissance tome, The Anatomy of Melancholy, by Robert Burton. I think, well, I've read... Well,
that's not going to improve your situation,
book.
Is it?
There was this guy in Christchurch, Oxford, where I was a student many, many years ago, clearly suffered from what we would call depression. But this book has a kind of mad energy to it. And I think the only hope I would have of getting from the beginning to the end would probably be to be abandoned with it on a desert island, like Prospero, for a number of years. So maybe as a kind of a guardian when the dark side comes on my desert island, Burton might be surprisingly interesting company.
Well, definitely a surprising and fun choice. Thank you for that suggestion. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I've recently, a little plug here, written a short book called How to Read a Poem, which my publisher tells me there are crates of it on a ship heading to America. So if that gets any response over there, that would be very exciting. I'm editing a journal at the moment and just starting to put together an issue on stories and storytelling, and that's very exciting. That's putting me in touch with people doing really interesting things in research in the classroom involving stories, and I'm learning a lot from doing that.
Wonderful. We'll definitely check out the How to Read a Poem. That's something I can link to for people to check out.
Well, thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, Malcolm, we really appreciate you being here today and discussing the Magus and helping us get to know Prospero a little better. It's been fun talking with you.
Well, it's fun for me too, and a great honor to be on your podcast. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Be sure to check out the show notes for today's episode. During the interview, the distance between the United States and the UK got the best of us over the internet today, and the audio was unintelligible during the part where Malcolm was sharing with me his recommended resources for learning more about the history of the Magus in England during Shakespeare's lifetime. He had several great suggestions, and we do include all of those authors and resources that he mentioned in today's show notes. You can find all of that and more Shakespeare history on this topic at CassidyCash.com/episode 30. That's CassidyCash.com/EP30. Would you like to meet me in England? In September 2019, I'm taking a group over with British History Tours to walk through the life of William Shakespeare. We'll be spending a couple of days in Stratford-upon-Avon, and then we'll travel over to London to see the Globe, where we'll have a private behind-the-scenes tour there, and we're hoping to get to see a play. And I want you to go with us. It would be amazing to get to meet you at all, but certainly to get to meet you in William Shakespeare's hometown would be amazing. Please consider traveling with us and get your early bird tickets while they last. There's still a few of them left, but we are only giving early bird tickets to the first 8 people who sign up. But you can still grab some of those and get all of the details about the trip at CassidyCash.com/travel Shakespeare. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. Until next time, I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope your week is a Shakespeare-filled week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.